My name is Luis Eslava and I'm based at Kent Law School where I teach international law. What I want to talk about today is the nature and the scope of my research. In my research, I'm trying to understand what is the relation that exists between international law and municipal, domestic, national, local law. And I do this through an examination of everyday life mostly in recent years, rapidly globalizing cities. My 3 research sites have been Istanbul, Bogotá, and Rio de Janeiro. And in my research, what I'm trying to understand is how cities, for example, like Istanbul, has come to embody in its everyday the international legal order. And this relationship between international law and domestic municipal law is interesting because international law has been often conceptualized. We often tend to think about international law as only existing in institutions like the United Nations or in international norms like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or in exceptional moments where heads of state come together to think and to regulate the world, for example, in the signature of the Atlantic Charter in 1941, or in the operations of international courts. Here, a photograph of the International Court of Justice. We think about international law as that law that tries to regulate moments of war or deployments of peacekeeping forces. Or we think about international law as that law that exists, tries to regulate the international trade order, which is a trade that doesn't occur within necessarily national state, but that occurs between national states. So at the core of traditional normal understandings of international law, there is a very interesting division between the international and the national. And this division sustains the field and gives the field of international law an identity. And even though we have developed a more sophisticated, nuanced understandings of international law, even though we have today multiple norms at the international level that speaks about the local order, even though international institutions are immersed in everyday life and international law, still at the formal level, international law continues to be defined according to this division between the international and the national. And we can see this understanding of international law in a famous textbook that is now widely used across the world to teach international law. So here we can see in Cho's, according to Cho, the author of this famous textbook, International Law, republished recently in 2014 by Cambridge University Press, that international law is defined in the following way. There are many contrasts between law within a country, municipal law, and the law that operates outside between states. Public international law covers relations between states in all the myriad forms, from war to satellites, and regulates the operations of the many international institutions. This definition that we can see in Cho has accompanied the field since its formation, especially at the end of the 19th century. So here an example from another textbook from that time, a very important manual on international law, and Lorimer's manual, published in 1883. And the title it speaks very strongly about this division between the international and the local. The title is The Institute of the Law of Nations, a treatise of the usual relations of separate political communities. As you can see here, the title conveys this idea that we live in a world that is organized according to national states. They regulate their internal life through their own governments, and they only occasionally come to contact and decide about juridical relationships that will kind of regulate what happens outside the national state. In international law, we try to think about the division and the connection between international and domestic legal orders through two different theories, the monist theory and the dualist theories. And even though these theories give us a doctrinal sense of how international norms, institutions, processes, aspirations come to inform or not domestic legal orders, for me, these two traditional ways of understanding that relationships is a little bit limited, in particular because it tends to forget that legal order that was born in the 17th century in Europe, that came to inform international law, that moment being the signature of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, in the 17th century, was expanded. It expanded as a result of the process of colonization and the colonization by center countries of peripheral areas of the world. And the process of imperial expansion and colonization was not simply a question of establishing trade relations across the world, extracting resources from the periphery. As we know, that process of imperial expansion was also accompanied by the proliferation of a particular, at the global level, across the globe, of a particular legal order, which we understand and we call the Jus Publicum Europaeum, the law of Europe that went from central countries to the world to regulate the globe as a whole. And as a result of this expansion of that particular legal order, the national state became one of the prime forms to think about the world. And that form of the national state that was born in Europe and speaks very strongly about the Leviathan, the Hobbes Leviathan, went across the world to organize social, economic, environmental relations. First, in the process of as a result of the processes of independence in the Americas, and then through the consolidation of the international legal order, through the workings of the League of Nations, and then later, very strongly, through the establishment of the United Nations. By the time of the establishment of the United Nations, the nation state became truly the form, the unit to think about how we should administer natural resources, social resources, and how we can make our world. This nation state went viral after the establishment of the United Nations through the process of decolonization. And as a result of the process of decolonization that started around the 1950s and that went through the 1960s and 70s, ended up as a result of that process is the world which we live in at the moment. A world that is visualized often through a collection of nation states that we hope separate, independent, self-determined. And this obviously speaks strongly about that. What is interesting when we think about this proliferation of the nation state critically is that the aspiration was to really create a world in which international relations were separated from national relations. However, what we have seen is that when the nation state went from Europe to the periphery of the world, the story that ended up coming from this process was not one in which the countries in the peripheries were able or have been able to fully, strongly control what happens within themselves. Okay? After 60 years from the foundations of the United Nations, so more than 60 years, what we can see are resilient, across the world, are resilient patterns of differentiation between highly developed countries and the developing countries. And we have tried to bridge that gap through, for example, development aid. But even though we have been putting lots of money to equalize levels of development across the world, and hopefully with that making able peripheral countries to control internal relations, we continue to see that instead of that close of the gap, what has happening or has been happening is accumulation of debt in South or global South countries. So what we have as a result is a very uneven world, between the center and the periphery. And that has produced a constant anxieties across these developing countries to catch up with center world standards. We have developed, or the world has developed, different mechanisms to ensure that that anxiety is permanent and then it's always there, igniting constant processes of local transformation in terms of international standards. As this watercolor demonstrates, the process of development of peripheral countries have been trying to be omnicomprehensive. It has really tried to transform local life constantly in terms of standards that are not necessarily standards that are natural to these places. We hope that as a result of that process, local life will be resembling more closely the international order. However, that story again hasn't been very clean. We want to believe that we are towards the end of poverty, but what we see on the ground are constant levels of inequality, and that without mention the very pressing question of environmental degradation. So in my research, what I've been trying to do is to understand how this really strong connection between the international and the domestic has come to affect local life. And I'm trying to understand how that impact occurs at the spatial level, but it's also how it has come to inform the relationship between national governments, local governments, and the peoples. Not simply people involved or engaged in formal transactions or in a formal relationship with those governments, but also people that are often understood as being outside the system, people that are engaged, for example, in the informal market. And more than that, how we have, in our everyday, come to construct ourselves according to standards, global standards that seems to reside at the global or inform what means to be global, what means to be international today. So as a result of my research, I have arrived to two simple conclusions that I would like to share with you. One of those conclusions is that if we really want to understand what international law is and how it works in the world, we need to accept that international law is at the center of a global normative order. Secondly, we need to accept that international law is constantly engaged in a process of global administration. A process of global administration that again operates at all levels, from the international to the national to the local. And if we are aware of this way in which international law works, we can understand that international law is not only about international institutions and norms and events, but also international law comes to exist through a multiplicity of norms and administrative procedures, multiple artifacts of governance, constant spatial transformations, and finally, the production of new subjectivities that are not necessarily perceived as international, but are certainly involved in a process of global ordering, a process of global making. Thank you very much.